Our next presentation is going to take us through the history of the Bodewadmi and their newly formed confederacy. Very exciting. Winona Elliott Bidobengwe is a Bodewadmi from Niashingaming, also known as Nawash First Nation. I did okay with that one. She has just completed work with the Nagdawenmag Benujiag. That's close. I'm sure she can probably say it a lot better than me. But it's a child and family services organization, and she works as a circle facilitator where she applies Anishinaabe principles and teachings to support families. She learned cultural practices from her parents, grandmother, aunties, and uncles. Her future will take her to work with the Bodewadmi in Wisconsin. She is a mother of 2 girls, and I'm very thankful she's here today because she is quite literally in the middle of moving to Wisconsin at this moment in time. Please put your hands together for Winona Elliott. Sorry. Just for you, it's a clicker for you.
Just that?
Yeah, so they'll
Okay.
advance your slides. You can see them. That's the slide you're on, and then that's the next slide.
Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, I'd like to thank you, Benny. I'd like to start off by saying I want to introduce myself in our language. So, Ani Bojo Bidaben Kwe Indigenous Ne Ashing Neming Donjiba Bodewadmi Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao. Sorry, Muz Minwa Gigo Dodem. My name is Winona. Bidaben Kwe is the name that my grandmother had given me, and that means that first pink sky in the morning. I'm an early riser, always have been, and I come from Ne'ashingneming First Nation, also known as Cape Croker, up on the Bruce Peninsula. But I also have ties to Serpent River First Nation on the North Shore and with Kawennakon Unceded First Nation. I belong to the Moose clan on my father's side, and I also acknowledge and pay homage to the Fish clan on my mother's side. As Benny had said, I'm a mother of 2, and I'm currently in the process of moving to work for Forest County Potawatomi community. So the reason why I'm here is that I wanted to talk a little bit about our history as Bodewadmi people. As you can see, that we come from the Three Fires Confederacy, and the Three Fires pertains to the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi people. We are one of the oldest alliances in the country, in North America. And our role as Potawatomi people are keepers of the fire. And we're also known as the little brother of the fire of the Confederacy. And that Confederacy was always built on respect and using our medicines and our traditional values to work together for all the same common goal. And that was that our ancestors had always thought about us, the 7 ahead and the 7 behind. So as you can see, there's some pictures there, and there's a little map there, and I'm going to keep looking. I'm not used to this, so I'm kind of used to this. But this map was created by my father, and I also will acknowledge him in my presentation as well. He did a lot of research, a lot of traveling, a lot of visiting, a lot of storytelling that he had been told by our relatives, his mother, his grandmother, about how we came over here to Canada from the US. So he did up this little map, and it's all of the tribes and the communities and the settlements at one time. And we all lived around each other around the Great Lakes. And as you can see, we were also trading partners, and we were also allies. And we fought along Tecumseh. And actually, just a little side piece, note here that Nawash fought alongside Tecumseh, and that's where our community comes in. He was a hereditary chief, and so he led us up towards the peninsula. And they also fought in the War of 1812 and Peoria. So why I added these pictures is just to kind of give you a little context and visual about our people over in the Great Lakes area. with Simon Kankodos, he was a hereditary chief that lived on the Lake Michigan side of Wisconsin. And he does talk about, you know, just through storytelling and research that my brother did as well, that he talks about how we traveled and migrated over from that side of the lake and how we ended up on the Bruce Peninsula, how Potawatomis from the tribes in Wisconsin settled in Manitoulin and the Bruce Peninsula. So part of the, after the wars, this is where the US government decided to start the Indian Removal Act. Now that kind of started a little prior to 1833, but 1833 is where the removal began from the Treaty of Chicago. So the government had promised that if the Potawatomi had left the Chicago area and around the Great Lakes, that they would be compensated for housing, annuities, food, everything that they needed to start over, basically. So they were pushed west. And obviously, like, that didn't happen over further time. So as you can see on this migration map, which I'll give props to my dad again, because he kind of made this map. You can see that there's a lot of direction of removal. There's a lot of movement going around. And then down in the west in Kansas and Oklahoma, that's where that removal was really being pushed for them to go west. And that's where that story comes in the history of the Potawatomi Trail of Death. There was a lot of people who had perished on that trail of being forced. They were forced and pushed to go west. Now, through other stories, when I talked to somebody in Wisconsin, a former tribal chairman, he talked about his tribe and how they were renegades in Wisconsin, and they ran around through that state, and you know, the government was chasing them, and they eventually gave up and just left them alone. So they have their community in northern Wisconsin. Some stayed in Michigan, lower Michigan. Some tribes were allowed to stay because they had adopted the religion, Christianity religion. So they were allowed to kind of just be left alone. And so you can see that, you know, there was a lot of movement, and part of our migration is that, you know, in order to get away and not to be forced to go west, a lot of our families or our people migrated to Canada. They went over the arc, which they'd call the arc, is from Wisconsin over to where you can see on the Bruce Peninsula. They crossed over, and that's where my relatives, that's what they did. We originate from Door County, Wisconsin, and I've read the stories, but I've heard the stories from my grandmother and how she heard it from her grandmother, that they would cross over and they migrated, but at night, so that they weren't seen. And they came over this way and they settled in Cape Croker. A lot of relatives also went through the St. Clair, up into Walpole Island, Kettle Point. And I also want to acknowledge that my daughter's paternal side, that's where they came from. They're Potawatomis from Michigan. So there was a lot of movement, and as you can see, we are the only Indigenous group to be displaced across 3 countries. We actually do have Potawatomis that live in Mexico, that migrated to Mexico. They kept going. So we have a really interesting story, and like other nations, you know, we lived our way off the land. We know how to, we were the keepers of medicine too. Knowledge sharing, traditional practices, and reading even interviews done by elders who have since passed in our community. They talked about that migration up to the Bruce Peninsula. And at one time, the Potawatomi were, when they had shown up, they were so strong in their culture and their traditional ways that the churches were worried about how close they were getting to the Ojibways, because they were trying to move their religion onto the Ojibways as well. So they perceived the Potawatomis as a threat because we come so hard with that fire and that way of being. So part of that migration is that anywhere as noted, from Clifton, 1833 and 1845, an estimated of 2,500 Potawatomis had migrated to Canada. The US did send instructed Worcester to delegate to do a count to see how many Potawatomis are actually residing within the Great Lakes, and you know, who we were promised annuities. But you know, when we talk about when I was listening to you talk about your data, right? It's like, how do we get that consensus? But there is the Worcester roll is online and available, and you can see all the names of where what community they landed on, and their names, their original names, and the child's age. So I'm really proud that our family is on that Worcester roll, and I've shown my children and their paternal families on that Worcester roll. These are just some visuals I wanted to provide you. Up in the top left corner there, that's the Ska'nikòn Reserve. That's where my daughters are from, which is next door to Cape Croker, where it belonged to the Ska'nikòn Ojibwe Nation. So that's an old photo. I'm guessing they're going into ceremony. At the bottom left is my daughter's great family. They traveled a lot back and forth between Canada and Michigan. And then the next picture is a photo of my mother and my father and my grandmother and my two brothers. And then here, I just put up a visual. This is me and my family standing on the bluff in our community of Nawash. When we look at the map as a whole, my late brother was able to understand why a lot of our people did migrate over to the Bruce Peninsula. It looks awfully familiar to the peninsula in Wisconsin, almost identical. So we couldn't help but wonder, you know, if that was just because that's a sense of home, right? When you're migrating, you're looking for that kind of that familiarity, having to leave one homestead to find another. So that's what it was, is just you know, some people will tell you, you know, we got chased out of the country. Some will tell you that, you know, we had to leave because we valued our life. We had to take our children and leave and go find somewhere to continue to be safe, because it was an unsure time at that time. There were also Potawatomis that were moved down into the east of Indiana, Illinois. So there's lots of historical information about that down that way as well. So you can see also with the red dots, this was another map my father made. And those are some of the First Nations that recognize that they do have Potawatomi descendants living in the communities, mostly around Georgian Bay, and some down towards Walpole Island, Kettle Point. And I just wanted to highlight, and I don't know if it's in my next slide. Oh, so I just wanted to highlight, because I always talk about this, is that Chippewas of Nawash, Neashing Naming, where I come from, where my beautiful sister Robin comes from, we're the largest Potawatomi settlement in Canada. At one time, there was 80% of Potawatomis that settled in the area. And at one time, they were working with Charles Kijik, and he was an interpreter, but also he kind of traveled a lot back and forth from Wisconsin, Michigan, and to Canada, kind of navigating that for Potawatomis. And at one time, the Potawatomis did ask for their own land in Canada to kind of start their own community and kind of formalize that way. But there was never any mention past that. So we kind of just stayed put, and then started working with our other relatives, the Ojibwe. So there's a lot. And so I will go to the next slide. Part of the Bodewadmis or Potawatomi Nation is that not too often you hear about other nations having gatherings solely for that nation. But the Potawatomis have been gathering since 1994, and it first started in Wasauksing, Ontario, up on the corridor near Parry Sound. And so every year the all the Potawatomis from the States, Canada, from the tribes, they pool all their resources together and they have a gathering. And that week-long gathering, I call it my Christmas. We all come together and there's language, there's knowledge sharing, there's workshops, but it's the feel of being together to get to know each other, and also seeing the similarities in appearance. And you might meet someone who looks like your auntie or your cousin, and that's just such a really good feeling. But it's about strengthening that relationship, and how can we help each other and continue to form that governance-like system within our nation to keep that fire going. So I just posted some photos. At the bottom left, though, it's a couple years ago, my late brother and we were talking about how, because of the the Chicago Treaty, which the Potawatomi settled, but we had to leave, there's this big sign near the waterway in Chicago, and it says, "You are on Potawatomi land." And so that year, 2021, we organized to have a pipe ceremony by that sign, by the water, and a lot of people came out. And it was a big moment because that was the first time that the US declared National Indigenous Peoples Day. So it was really beautiful, and we talked about how do we keep going? How do we keep working together as a nation? So what had ended up happening was they started forming an economic summit, because we talk about that relationship and that start with the fire and the SEMA, and how do we keep supporting each other through economic adventure? How do we keep lifting each other up to have our own capital, to be our own sovereign nations and working together? So that's what the tribal leaders from all the Potawatomi tribes would come together and have those discussions and talk about resource sharing, what tribe can do with this tribe. And so this was started in 2019, and it still continues yearly and sometimes quarterly. So this summer at the Potawatomi gathering, these are the list of the First Nations and tribes that had come together and decided to form a newly formed Bodewadmi Confederacy. It was a big deal. It is a big deal as we come together to start looking ahead in that governance, the vision. It always starts with that fire and that SEMA. And so we're reclaiming what our natural way has always been in working together for nations. And that starts with ceremony, that starts with fire and our SEMA, but also a collective understanding of working together. And that's what the Confederacy is going to start doing. And so these are the tribes that are from Kansas, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Canada. And so they will start doing some work moving forward. So it was a really great day because not often this does not happen. It's been a long time. So that's kind of where we're heading. And so along with the Confederacy, we'll continue to restore the vision and hope that, like I said before, our ancestors had always dreamed about this for us. And so we need to come back together and remember that. And we will share knowledge and resources that strengthen in each community. So I just want to give you an example. Our community where we come from, we are fishermen, and we have maple syrup. That's our big production that helps our community. And there's tribes down in the States that have casinos and restaurants and would love to purchase all kinds of maple syrup. So it's doing that. It's how do we connect here to here and support each other in that nationhood building. And we also have to keep in mind too that we are Jay Treaty Indians, and the Confederacy will have to work on that part next, as because there's a border that kind of separates on different levels, but we have to keep working together so that we can do that, because that's our inherent right as Anishinaabe people. So it'll draw on the strength of each member to achieve that common goal in the Confederacy. So this is new. There's not much more I can add to that, but this is very exciting, and this is how it will start as Anishinaabe people, or the Bodewadmis. And it's all based on the storytelling, the knowledge sharing. But again, it's that collective work that the goal is to lift each other up in our nationhood and to provide that sustainability for a good life for our children and our grandchildren and those generations to come. How am I for time? I feel like I'm flying. I feel like I'm missing some pieces, but so the last piece I wanted to the slide I wanted to do an acknowledgement. So the power of one, and my mother just told me about this, is that, and we kind of, the power of one, that one person can make such a grand change, a huge change. And so I wanted to add these photos and remember my brother Giwedamba. So he left this world not too long ago, but he made a huge impact because it was him that came in with this vision of saying, hey, how do we get everybody together? How can we start talking about the economy within our nations? How can we start helping each other? How do we build these relationships? And, a lot of these tribal leaders in the Bodewadmi Nation will tell you that it wouldn't have happened without him. And that he brought everybody together and said, I have this great idea. And it started with the economic summit. He brought everybody together and said, this is what we can do. And he picked up that work from my late father, who I'd mentioned earlier, Haudenosaunee, and doing the research and knowing. And why they put their life into this work is because it's important for us to know who we are as a people, and that we have our own internal fire that we need to keep well in order to do this good work as an individual, but also as a collective and as a nation. Because everything that we do and think and pray is all around the fire. Everything for us is around the fire. So I wanted to acknowledge that because I have learned so much by traveling with them and listening and hearing the stories from my grandmother and knowledge sharing. And that's what it comes down to is, telling those stories, but, and that's why I'm here, is to tell you this story about the Bodewadmi people and who we are and where we're going. And that's the direction that we're going in, is that we have to move as a collective, but we can't forget how we got there and our knowledge and our traditions. And that fire is the most important thing. So I wanted to pay homage to him, because none of this, the Confederacy, none of that would have started if it wasn't for him and those visions. So I think that's it.